Hey everyone, welcome to our next video. In this video, I want to go over an example of how we can use a couple of modules in Python and sort of leverage them to do something kind of neat. Ultimately, we're going to look at a recipe finder where we give it a few ingredients and it goes out and returns to us a few recipes from the internet. So to do that, we're going to be using two different modules. Um, one of which is not included standard with Python, so it's not one of those built-in modules. You will have to go out and install this separately, and I have a video linked in Moodle on how to do that. I think it's called installing pip and the request module. So that's what we're looking at right here is request. If you haven't looked at that and gone through that video already, please just go ahead and pause this, go back, go through the installation so that you can keep up and go through this example as well. So request is known as HTTP for humans. It allows us to do common HTTP requests such as GET or POST. And if you're not familiar with those, that's okay. I think it'll be kind of obvious how those are used through our example here. But basically, we can tell requests to go out and get a web page, and what it'll return to us are a few different things, as we can see listed. It'll return to us some JSON, some text, an encoding, so what kind of character encoding was returned, any headers that were returned from that web page, a status code, so 200 just means okay, everything went well. And what we're going to be using is the text that gets returned, and that text is usually just, or it is just the source code that gets returned when we make that request. And what typically happens is our browser will look through this source code and it'll format it and make it look nice like this. All right, so we're going to be making requests to different or to a public API, and an API is an application programming interface. And essentially there's websites out there that you can make requests to, and they will return data to you in a specific format. And the format that we're going to be looking at is JSON. So we're going to need a second module, the JSON module, which is built into Python. We just simply import JSON and it's brought into our namespace. And JSON can do some cool things. We can pass it some Python data structures like a list, or in this case a list that contains a dict, and it'll format that into JavaScript object notation. Now, JSON is very similar to Python notation. There's just a few caveats in it. So you want to make sure that you do use the library and just not try to parse through that yourself. The method or the function that we're going to be using is load_s. So load_s takes a string, which we're going to be getting from our web page response, and it says take this string and parse it. We're telling it that it is JSON, and we want for it to parse it and return to us a Python object. So it'll return to us a dictionary, and that dictionary will contain all of the other data structures that were within that JSON object. So I think that's enough of a primer for us. If we run into anything else, I'll talk through it as we go. What I want to show you next is this list of public APIs, and I've also included this on Moodle so that you guys can go through and perhaps be inspired and find some modules or some public APIs that you would like to access based on the method that we're using here in this example. Alright, so this is just a big list of public APIs. The one that I'm interested in for this example is under food and drink, but you can see that there are a ton of different categories in here that you can go into, and this list is by no means exhaustive. It's really great that I guess Todd Moto put this together. I found a couple other ones as I was searching. This just happened to be like the first hit on Google when I searched for public APIs. Alright, so I'm interested, like I said, in writing a program that will take some ingredients and give me some recipes that I can do with that. So that's going to be under food and drink. And for each of these, and this is really nice that Todd did this for us, he lists the type of authentication that's required to use the API. If that API uses HTTPS, so HTTP over TLS or SSL, and then a link to it. Now, a lot of APIs require you to register with their site and they give you an API key. So that's why you see API key listed in a lot of these, and that key just associates you to that request. There's a couple other different ways, like OAuth is another way. It's a little bit more complex than just an API key. So if you wanted to use this Steam or Steam client integration, you'd have to go through and get set up with OAuth. But there are a number in here that don't require any type of authentication. So for our example, I thought that would be good. And oh Lord, I lost my place. Let's go back to food. Food and drink. I want to look at this recipe puppy. All right. So what I did was I came through this list. I saw that it didn't require auth, and I thought, all right, let me give that a try. I like the site because the site is very simple. It gives me a brief example of how I can use the API. So essentially, I just make a request to recipepuppy.com/API, and then these guys at the end are known as the query string. They contain different parameters that I can pass in. So this I, and for a query string, we use a question mark followed by the parameter. I equals onions, comma, garlic. And then we use an ampersand to sort of put all of these parameters together that we want to pass in. So ampersand Q is for the query. So we're searching for an omelet that perhaps contains onions and garlic. And this P is for page, so page equals 3. They also have a way of changing the format to XML if that's something that you'd want to do. The default is JSON though, and I find JSON way easier to read through and parse through and use with the different modules than XML, but there are modules out there that will help you parse out XML, very similar to what we're doing with JSON. All right, so let's look at the example and see what this returns to us. Awesome. Now, if you're following along, it probably doesn't look as pretty and nice as this. In fact, it probably looks more like this. This is still JSON. It's the JSON text or JSON object being returned to us, but it's not formatted at all. So when I first came in and I saw that, I immediately thought, I bet you there's a plugin or something I could install that'll clean that up for me. And turns out there was. If you just search for your browser and JSON viewer, JSON parser, I think I just searched for Chrome JSON viewer, and this plugin was one of the first hits on the Google search page. So I added this to Chrome and then refreshed this page, and that plugin is, or extension is right here. As soon as it realizes that there's some JSON on the page, it'll go through and parse it out for you. So I really like that. It lets me be able to collapse things and expand them as needed, as well as it parses it out and makes it a lot easier to read than what we saw in that other browser window. So let's see what all this returned to us. It returns a title, so Recipe Puppy, the version, which I guess the API version 0.1, href, which is just a URL back to Recipe Puppy, and then we get some results, and those results are in a list. So like I said, a lot of JSON looks a lot like Python, so we have a list here of other JSON objects. I guess that's one of the big things with JSON is Python calls these dicts, whereas JSON calls them objects. But we have a title inside this object, which eventually we're going to convert this into Python objects, so it will be a dict. We have a title, vegetable pasta oven omelet. We have an href. We have ingredients, so all of the ingredients that are required for this, and then a thumbnail, which, let's take a look at that. A little bit small, but we blow that up some, and I guess if it wasn't so blurry, we'd be able to tell that that was a vegetable omelet. Cool, so each one of these separated with a comma, just like a normal list, and it looks like we're returned a bunch of different results for these different recipes. So at this point, what I want to do is I don't start writing my script immediately, or at least I didn't to go through this. Instead, what I did was I opened up idle and I started playing around to get a better idea of how I was going to use this API in my script. So I know that I need to use those two modules because I'm going to be making requests. So I'll import request, and I know I'm going to need to parse JSON, so I'll import some JSON. And let's actually go back here. I want to grab this URL, and I want to point out that these parameters are optional, so we don't have to provide any of them. I'm just going to provide the ingredients and present a list back to the user of the different recipes. So what I want to do is just grab the first part of this URL all the way up to this I equals, and I'm going to call this my base URL. Now I plan on doing string formatting with this, so I'm just going to put a %s in here, and that way I can just substitute back in my list of ingredients and then make my request. Okay, so I have that base URL. I can imagine that I'm going to be getting some ingredients from the user and placing them into a list. So let's say we do onions and garlic, and that's the contents of my list there. From there I needed to figure out how could I join this together with commas in between, and of course I could go through and build up something using a loop, but there is another way, and I'll show you a really easy way to combine elements in a list into a string and to concatenate them with a certain token or a certain character is to take that character like a comma and tell it or use the dot operator to access its methods. And what I want to do is I want to join everything in this iterable, and an iterable is a list because it's something that we can iterate over. So join everything in ingredients. Now I'm not assigning this to anything, so we're going to see what gets returned, and it's onions, comma, garlic. And if I were to do like ingredients dot append, let's say pepper, and then join my ingredients that way, you see it just puts a comma in between every element and it returns it as a string, so I can use that string to substitute back in here. So that's kind of the direction that I'm trying to go here with it. Alright, so let me get a request URL. So I'm going to create a different variable for that. I'm going to set it equal to my base URL, and I'm going to substitute back in this comma.join ingredients. Okay, so Python's going to take this, convert it to this list. Once it does that, it'll make the substitution, and then we can see our request URL. Awesome. So since we can see that, let's actually copy it, and we'll come up here, get a new tab going, Okay, so this is what's going to be returned from it. This looks pretty authentic. Quincitos verdes in, I don't know, escabeche? Not really sure, but looks like a green bananas recipe. Buffalo skewers, pickled sweet pepper recipe. Awesome. So we got some good results here. The next thing that we want to do is programmatically make that request. So when we make a request, we need to store what gets returned somewhere. I'm going to call that my response. I'll set that equal to request.get. So I'm referencing my namespace up here, and I'm going to use the get method, or the get function. Looking over here, you can actually, should be able to drill down into this somewhere and get some documentation here. So make a request. And this talks about how to use it. So that's kind of how I got familiar with it. So a lot of these modules, you're going to have to read through the documentation some and figure out how to use it. But request is really easy to use. So let's go back here. Request.get, and I want to get that request URL. All right. If we look at what response is, we see that it says that the response was 200. Now, one thing that we can do when we're in the interactive prompt is we can use this dir method, and it will tell us a little bit about what all is, I guess, a property of response. So response has all of these different properties, one of them being text, and that's kind of what we were interested in. If you remember, I alluded to that earlier. So let's look at response.text, and that is that very nasty looking unformatted JSON that we're seeing over here in its cleaned up version. Awesome. So we are getting our data from the website. Now what we need to do is go ahead and parse through that data. So I'm going to create a variable called data, and we'll use our JSON module and load it up with a string, and that string is going to be my response.text. So all of this I'm passing to my JSON's load s function, and it's going to convert this into Python objects. So we'll get a dict, and that dict will probably contain some other things like, well, it's going to have some keys like title, version, href, and results is going to be a list that contains other dictionaries. So we're going to need to be pretty familiar with our data structures and trying to drill down into them. All right, so let's look at data now. That looks a lot similar, right? And that has a lot to do with JSON objects just basically looking a lot like Python objects. But up here at the top, we see our key results and then our list. So it goes into that, and our thumbnail, ingredients, title, and href. Okay. So from there, if that wasn't obvious and it wasn't easy to pick through, and honestly this helps out a lot over here because these are our keys and our list and everything, but we could look at data.keys and get an idea of what keys we could reference. Then we could do data results, and then this is just our results list. Okay, so data results sub 0 will give us our first one, which should be this green bananas recipe here. So we got the green bananas recipe, and then we can drill down even further by picking out, let's say, like its title. Awesome. Now, one thing that's kind of annoying is some of these have these new line characters on them. If you do a Google search for how to remove new line characters or white space from the end of a string, or even from the beginning of a string, there's a few different methods or string methods called strip, and strip will just remove anything that causes white space at the beginning and the end. I think there's also an L strip that'll just do it from the front, and an R strip that'll just do it from the back. But let me show you what that does, because essentially what this is just a string. And if we call strip on it, so the dot strip method, you see now those new line characters are gone, with the exception of the one in the middle, because strip doesn't look for that. But it's cleaned up a little bit, and now I can use this in an output. So at this point, I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of how I'm going to use the API and the different modules in my script. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new script file. And I'm just going to save this as recipefinder.py. Alright, so as we saw before, we need our imports at the top, so we'll import request and import JSON. Then we're going to go ahead and create that base URL. And for a lot of this, if you keep the idle window open, you can just come back and copy and paste. Which saves you a lot of time then. Okay, so I'm going to define a main here. Just say pass for now, and then if that name equals main, we'll call main. Cool, so first thing I want to do is create my ingredients list. Now I'm not going to hard code it. Instead, what I want to do is get it from the user. So let me just print out a message here to please enter your ingredients one at a time, and then leave blank when done. Alright, so let's say our current ingredient comes from our input, and then while current is not an empty string, let's append that to our list. And then of course, before we come back up, we need to modify our condition, so we'll get a new current. So once we get out of this while loop, I should have a list of ingredients, and then I can go ahead and build up my request URL like we did before. So it's going to be our base URL with our joined list ingredients. Okay. And then looking back over here in idle, at that point we went ahead and did our request.get. So then I'll have a response equals request.get our request URL. And then that was us looking at it. So the next thing we did was convert that JSON into Python objects. So data equals json.loads response.text. Cool. So now I think what I want to do is print out just a list of all of the titles. So let's look at, we want to look at each one of these dictionaries that are inside this results list. And I want to loop through all of them. So I'm going to call it a result. So for result in data results. So remember, data.results is this list, and I'm going to loop through each element that's in there, and each one is a dictionary. So I may want to pull out the title and say that that is result subtitle here, and then let's just print title. Okay, if I save that, let's come over here and run it. It's probably a little bit hard to see, so let me bring that up. Ingredients, let's say onion and pepper. And we're getting a lot of results here. What you'll notice is there's these line breaks in here, and that was the whole point of the strip. So let's actually come back here and say, all right, let's strip out those line breaks. Run it again. We'll do onion. If I can spell right, pepper. Cool, so now we don't get any of those line breaks. Everything's coming out one line at a time. And then from this point, I would go ahead and clean it up some. So something else I may want to do is pull out that href, because that is the URL to get to that recipe. So that was results of href, and I figured that out just by looking at the keys that would be in the dictionary. So we may want to print title, we may want to print href, and then let's say a new line. If I run that, onion, pepper. Cool, so now we're seeing our title and our href. Something else we might want would be our ingredients. Salt, ingredients. So why don't we print those out in between? Awesome. So now we're getting that list of ingredients here that we would need in order to make this dish. And the last thing I'd probably do is maybe number it and then just clean up the way that it's being displayed, which I think is kind of fine. I might preface this with the word ingredients and just put a number in front of this. So one easy way to number this would be to use that enumerate function. So that's going to return to us the result and the index, with the index being first. And then let's see, let's print out our number followed by our title. And of course indexes start at 1, so I'm going to add 1 to it for each print. And then down here, we can say that our ingredients are going to be these ingredients, and then we'll have the href followed by a blank line. Okay, so let's run this. Onions and peppers. Oh Lord, I broke it. Alright, what did I do here? I'm thinking that maybe when I put in onions and peppers, it did not like that. Let's see what gets returned when we do that. So we're getting a 404 file not found error, and what's happening, we can look at this and see that the JSON decoder is expecting something on line 1, column 1, basically the first character, and it's not getting anything. So 404 is another HTTP status code, and it means that the file is not found, like it says here. There's several other status codes, like 500, where an internal server error occurred, and 200 is really the only one that we're looking for, because that means that the request went well. So we could probably just put an if statement, put this for loop inside an if statement to check and make sure that our results were had a status code of 200. So let's just look real quick. If we import request and what am I doing? Request.get, let's say google.com, and let's look at R and see what all attributes it has. And status code is the one that I was looking for. So r.statuscode is an integer, and we want for it to be 200. So here, our source code, let's say if, actually, before we parse the data, we want to do this. So let's say if our response.statuscode is 200, then do this stuff, else print an error has occurred. Okay. Something else I just noticed is this should not be a comma, this should be a % so that the substitutions happen. Alright, let's try this one more time. I actually want to try the bad example first. Onions and peppers. Awesome. So now we're not getting this nasty looking error because we checked for it. Now we're just getting a nice printout saying that an error occurred. Now one more time the correct way. Let's say we had some onion and pepper and maybe some chicken, and we want to figure out what we could make. So we have 10 different possibilities here. Maybe I want to do the island jerk chicken. Then we can copy this URL, go to the website, and follow along with the, what a bad example. Let's try the Adobe Filipino style chicken. Cool, so we could just follow along with the recipe here. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed going through this example. If you have any questions or issues, please let me know. If not, I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Thank you.